Afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you. Erev Shabbos Yom Shishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Lorraine in Texas, Yehuda in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Chaim in Florida, Moshe in Brooklyn, Ella in Southern California, Lanit in Silver Spring. Welcome, everybody. Starting a new Mishna today, Mishna number 5 here in chapter 2 of Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. A very intricate, difficult section that we've been studying for about a month now, and it's not easy, right? It's not easy. It's all about God specified in the Torah certain offerings that could be brought and certain aspects of each of those offerings, what would make them qualified and fulfill the obligation of the person bringing the offering, and what would disqualify them. And if disqualified, what does that mean? Right? Does it just simply mean that the person didn't fulfill his obligation, but we finished the procedure of bringing that offering, or do we stop the procedure in its tracks? If certain kinds of offerings can be disqualified by a wrong intent, for example, to eat it beyond its time, or eat it out of its place, or to sprinkle the blood beyond its time or in the wrong place, and that applies to one kind of offering, that sort of error and the disqualification that would ensue. Do we apply the same disqualification if a similar error was made with respect to a different offering? And how do we know? When did the sages give themselves the right to extend an element of one law, of one kind of offering, to the law of a different kind of offering? What gives them that right? When do they give themselves that right? How clear does it have to be? Where they're finding linkages, for example, in the language of one kind of offering compared to another kind of offering, but a similar linkage is available to a different offering that would produce a separate result. So why would we privilege one linkage, let's say between a word used in this verse and a word used in that verse, versus a different word used in this verse, which links to a different verse that has that word in it? And why would we privilege, like I said, this linkage over that linkage? These are the kind of questions that they are wrestling with, and we're really sharpening our own minds and analytical ability by trying to follow the analysis and interpretation of our sages. Okay, Mishnah 5 here in chapter 2. This is the principle with regard to anyone who slaughters the animal, or who collects the blood, or who conveys the blood, or who sprinkles the blood, remembering, right, that when an animal is satisfying the obligation of a person to bring a sin offering, to bring a guilt offering, to bring an elevation offering. What is it that actually satisfies the obligation? What is it that atones for him? Right, in the sin offering or guilt offering, we get it atones. But in the Pesach, right, that bringing the Pesach or an Ola, an elevation offering, sometimes that's required. Sometimes it's a free will offering. But if the person is obligated, in all these cases, what aspect of the offering actually fulfills the obligation? It's sprinkling the blood on the altar. But as we've seen, the animal, in order to have blood to sprinkle, has to be slaughtered. The slaughter doesn't have to be done by a priest, but it has to be done with the correct intention for the right kind of offering, and that the elements which follow will be the correct elements. Then the blood has to be collected. This is the blood of the soul, right? The blood of life, as the animal bleeds out as it's slaughtered in the temple. That blood has to be collected by a priest with the correct intent, and a qualified priest, not a disqualified priest, and not a priest who's otherwise qualified but didn't do something like wash his hands and feet that day. So it has to be collected by a priest, conveyed to the altar by a priest, and then sprinkled on the altar and in the correct location on the altar. Right? These are all the elements that we've been talking about. So says this Mishnah that this is a principle. What's the principle? With regard to anyone who slaughters the animal, or who collects the blood, or who conveys the blood, or who sprinkles the blood, with intent to partake of an item whose typical manner is such that one partakes of it. For example, the meat of the offering that is eaten. If it's a peace offering, it's eaten by the owner. If it's a sin offering, it's eaten by priests. But there is meat of offerings that is eaten, as opposed to a burnt offering, also known as an elevation offering, where nobody eats of that offering except the altar, right? That animal is consumed entirely on the altar, and so it's as if the altar eats, right? The altar consumes. It's just a kind of metaphoric way of speaking, but people don't eat, right? So here they're talking about the kind of offerings that people eat of it versus the kind of offerings that people don't eat of it. So if this person is slaughtering, collecting the blood, conveying it, or sprinkling, with intent to partake of an item, right? He's going to eat of it. And it's an item whose typical manner is such that one eats of it. So, for example, the meat of an offering. Or he's intending to burn an item whose typical manner is such that one burns it on the altar, right? So it's an elevation offering, and he has the correct intent. He is planning to burn that meat on the altar and not eat of it. So if his intent was to partake of or to burn the measure of an olive bulk outside its designated area, okay, so he understands that it's the right kind of offering. He has in mind the correct kind of offering. And if it's an offering that it needs to be eaten, he's intending to eat of it. Or if it's an offering that needs to be burned, he's intending to burn of it. But here comes the error. He's intending to eat or burn it in the wrong place, right? In the wrong place, outside its designated area. Then the offering is disqualified, but there is no liability for kares for burning or partaking of it. Because as we've already learned, when the error is with respect to burning, sprinkling, eating, and doing it in the wrong place, that will disqualify the offering, but and therefore it should not be eaten, or it should not be burned on the altar. If then one does burn it on the altar or eat of it, he will have violated a prohibition, but it won't be one that incurs kares, death at the hands of the heavenly court, because the mistake was with respect to place as opposed to time. But there is no liability for kares for burning or partaking of it. However, if his intent was to do the eating, which is correct, he should be eating it, or burning it, which is correct, he should be burning it, but his intent at the time of slaughter, collecting the blood, conveying it, or sprinkling it, is that he will do the burning or partaking beyond the allotted time, after the deadline, and he's intending to eat it after the allotted time from the beginning, then he will disqualify it. It will become prohibited to eat it if it's one for eating, or to burn it on the altar if it's one for burning. And if he violates that prohibition and eats it or burns it despite the prohibition, then he will be subject to karas, which is death at the hands of the heavenly court. Because in that case, the offering is pigul, which the Torah specifies, and one is liable to receive karas for burning or partaking of it, provided that the permitting factor, which is the blood being sprinkled, is sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah, right? In other words, provided that you didn't make any other mistakes. If other mistakes were made, like the blood was sprinkled in the wrong place, then we would take the pigul off the table. The offering would still be disqualified, but if he ate of it, it would not be pigul, and he wouldn't get karas for violating that prohibition. How is the permitting factor sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah? If one slaughtered the animal in silence, with no specific intent, and he collected and conveyed and sprinkled the blood with intent to burn or partake of the offering beyond its designated time, or if one slaughtered with intent to burn or partake of the offering beyond its designated time, and he collected and conveyed and sprinkled the blood in silence, or if one slaughtered the animal and collected and conveyed and sprinkled the blood with intent to burn or partake the offering beyond its designated time, this is the case where one sacrifices the permitting factor in accordance with its mitzvah. In other words, the only mistake he made was having an intent to consume beyond its allotted time. That was the only mistake he made. How is the permitting factor not sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah? Meaning, what would be the introduction of a second error? If one slaughtered the animal with intent to burn it or partake of it outside its designated area, and he collected and conveyed and sprinkled the blood with intent to burn it or partake of it beyond its designated time. So he had intent with respect to the wrong area and intent with respect to the wrong time. Or if one slaughtered the animal with intent to burn it or partake of it beyond its designated time, and collected and conveyed and sprinkled the blood with intent to burn it or partake of it outside its designated area. In this case, two errors. He made the mistake with intent with respect to time first, and then made the error with respect to place. In the first example, he had an error with respect to place first, and then an error with respect to time. But both times, there's two errors, and that's why pigul will not take hold. Or if one slaughtered the animal and collected and conveyed and sprinkled the blood with intent to burn it or partake of it outside its designated area, these are cases in which the permitting factor is not sacrificed in accordance with the mitzvah, and so no pigul. Similarly, in the case of the Pesach, the Passover lamb or goat, similarly in the case of the Pesach and the sin offering, that one slaughtered not for their sake, which would entirely disqualify it, as we learned in chapter 1, and therefore you could not even finish, you couldn't consider it a burnt offering and bring it to the altar. With a Pesach or a sin offering, if you mistaken intent with respect to what kind of offering you're bringing, as soon as you realize that, end, fully disqualified, doesn't atone for the person, and won't be considered a gift offering either. You can't bring it to the altar. Similarly, in the case of a Pesach and the sin offering that one slaughtered not for their sake, and one collected and conveyed and sprinkled the blood with intent to burn it or partake of it beyond its designated time, right? Two mistakes. Wrong kind of offering, and intending to consume beyond its time or to sprinkle beyond its time. Or if one slaughtered the Pesach or the sin offering with intent to burn it or partake of it beyond its designated time, and he collected and conveyed and sprinkled the blood not for their sake, right? So again, two errors, but in this case, the time error first, and then the mistake with which kind of offering second. Or that one slaughtered the Pesach or the sin offering and collected and conveyed and sprinkled the blood not for their sake. That, right, two errors again at the two stages. That is the case of an offering whose permitting factor is not sacrificed in accordance with its mitzvah, and that's why pigul will not apply. And if one performed one of the sacrificial rites with intent to eat an olive bulk, so that's going to be a kezayit, right? A kezayit, it's a measure of volume, about the volume of an olive, and that's the minimum measure that we need in order to violate this kind of prohibition. So if one performed one of the sacrificial rites with intent to eat a kezayit outside its designated area and a kezayit the next day, right? Mistake with respect to place and with respect to time. Or a kezayit the next day and a kezayit outside its designated area. Or half a kezayit outside its area and half a kezayit the next day, right? Half the minimum measure outside its place and half the minimum measure beyond its time. Has he done anything? Are we going to combine those two half measures? Otherwise, he hasn't done anything wrong if it's less than the minimum measure. Has he? Let's keep reading. The offering is disqualified, and there is no liability for kares for burning or partaking of it. Is that because we combine those amounts? Rabbi Yehuda said that this is the principle in any case where the intent with regard to the time, right, the mistaken intent with regard to time, that you would eat of it beyond its allotted time. Anytime the intent with regard to time preceded the intent with regard to the area, the place, so the offering is pigul, and one is liable to receive kares for partaking of it. Now, Rabbi Yehuda is disagreeing with the majority. The majority will say, and has been saying, if there's two errors, pigul doesn't take hold. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, if you first made a mistake with regard to time, the pigul error, then you made a pigul error, and pigul applies, even though you later had a second error. Says Rabbi Yehuda, and if the intent with regard to the area preceded the intent with regard to the time, then the offering is disqualified and there is no kares because your first error was not with respect to time and therefore not with respect to pigul. And the rabbis say, meaning the majority who disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, in both this and that case, the offering is disqualified and there's no liability for kares for burning or partaking of it. If his intent was to eat half an olive bulk, half a kezayit, and to burn half a kezayit, not at the appropriate time or in the appropriate area, the offering is fit because eating and burning do not join together. So if you had an intent with respect to less than the minimum measure, even if you had two wrong intents, but each of them was with respect to less than the minimum measure, you didn't do anything. The offering remains fit because your intent didn't amount to a reversible error and it didn't amount to a disqualifying error. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The Gemara. With regard to the disagreement between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis concerning a case where one has intent with regard to both time and area, right, where Rabbi Yehuda says, well, if you first had a mistake with respect to time, that could render it pigul, and if you then violate the prohibition after it was disqualified, you eat it anyway, you would be subject to kares, right? And that was the minority opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So with respect to that, Ilfa says there is a disagreement only with regard to two sacrificial rites, i.e. where each intent was held during a different rite. But if both were held in the course of one rite, all agree that it constitutes a combination of intentions and the offering is not rendered pigul. Right? In other words, if even Ilfa is saying that even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that even though he had a mistaken intent with regard to that, I'm going to eat some of it beyond its time, and then he had another intent with regard to the same rite, not the same offering, but I guess the same element of that offering, that was also about its time, then no, I guess he had two intents, let's say with slaughter. Slaughter is one of the rites, right? So at the time of slaughter, he's saying, I'm going to eat some of it after the allotted time, and I'm going to eat some of it outside of its place. But both intents are at the time of slaughter. So that Ilfa is saying that even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that pigul does not apply because there were two mistakes in the same element and they're going to be considered simultaneous, not one before the other. or maybe not, right? But that would be a reason why even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that the pigul problem, the error with respect to time, didn't precede the mistake with respect to area, but was rather simultaneous with it. And Rabbi Yochanan says, even if the intentions were both held in the course of one rite, like slaughter, collecting the blood, etc., there is still a disagreement between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. So the Gemara asks, granted, the Mishnah is understandable according to Ilfa, since the first clause of the Mishnah, if one slaughtered the animal in silence, with no specific intent, and he collected the blood beyond it with the intent to sprinkle it beyond its designated time, or at the time of collecting the blood, he had an intent about consuming the meat or sprinkling the blood beyond its allotted time. So this is referring to different intentions held in the course of two sacrificial rites. So one can assume that the latter clause is referring to two rites as well. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, could it be that the first clause is referring to two separate rites and the latter clause is referring to only one rite? Now we're on page 30a. The Gemara responds, yes, it can be explained that, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that we were starting about halfway down 29b. Now we're on page 30a. And our daf today is page 30. The Gemara responds, yes, it can be explained that the first clause is referring to two different sacrificial rites, while the latter clause, i.e. the disagreement between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, applies to both one rite and to two rites. So the Gemara suggests a proof. We learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says that this is the principle. If the intent with regard to the time preceded the intent with regard to the area, the offering is pigul, and one is liable to receive kares for burning or partaking of it. Right? Whereas the rabbis say, even though you did that first and pigul would apply, then when you compounded your error with another error later, not with respect to time, but with respect to place, now pigul does not apply, because when there's two errors, pigul does not apply. And the rabbis overruled Rabbi Yehuda. But you can see Rabbi Yehuda's point. Once pigul set in, what difference does it make if you have a mistaken error later? Now, granted, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the disagreement applies even to one rite, right, that you could have two mistaken intents at the time of slaughter, this is the principle indicating that the principle is broad. But according to Ilfa, what is added by the phrase, this is the principle? And the Gemara responds, this indeed poses a difficulty to the opinion of Ilfa. Now, we learned in a Mishnah elsewhere, in Tractate Temura 25b, and now we're going to get into a lengthy discussion that's a little bit technical, but I find absolutely fascinating. And that's why I titled today's class, This and That, or This Then That, right? And so very often, when we're expressing stuff that happens in the real world through the imperfect lens of language, we describe two things that happen simultaneously, but we can't, unless you're singing, where two voices can harmonize and say two different things at the same time. But normally when one person is talking, he can't describe two things that happen simultaneously with simultaneous words, right? He has to describe one thing first and then the other. Now he could say, and these things happen simultaneously, but he's going to have to describe one before the other. Now, if somebody doesn't tell you they happen simultaneously, you're going to assume that the one he describes first happened first. But when you're talking about laws, it gets a little bit nuanced, right? And so let's see how this works out. They're going to bring in law from elsewhere about Temura. Temura is the concept, not teruma, which is consecrating a tithe, right, that's given to priests that they have to eat in sanctity. But temura, which means substitution, right? So the idea is there is a law in the Torah that if you consecrate, one of your sheep, and you say, I'm going to bring this sheep as an offering in the Holy Temple. You only do this when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. But now you've consecrated that sheep. Essentially, that sheep doesn't belong to you anymore. That sheep now belongs to heaven, and you are its caretaker, and it's your job to get it to Jerusalem and offer it, assuming that it doesn't develop a blemish. Now, maybe you change your mind and you say, you know what, I like that sheep. I don't want to give that sheep to the temple. That sheep is a certain kind of sheep that I have a a friend who's coming to dinner, and the meat of this sheep is exactly what my friend likes. So I'll substitute a different sheep, bigger one, plumper, more valuable, and bring the substitute as an offering in the holy temple. I'll give heaven more than I was going to give before. So you might justify to yourself in this way. But the Torah says you can't do that. If you consecrate a sheep and then you consecrate another sheep to be its substitute, the result is, number one, you violated a prohibition because you can't make a substitute for something that's consecrated. And number two, the first one remains consecrated. And number three, the new sheep that you consecrated is also consecrated, right? So you violated a prohibition, you did something wrong, and the consequence of it is that you may have to bring an offering or suffer consequences for violating the prohibition, or maybe I'm not sure the full consequence, but definitely the first one remains consecrated and the new one is also consecrated. You're not going to have to bring two sheep. Right? So that's the basic concept of Tamura. I don't know if you do that intentionally, knowing that it's not permitted, whether you could be subject to lashes for violating a prohibition. I'm not sure about that. But in any case, both sheep would then be consecrated. Okay, now where this is going to become relevant to what we're doing here is when things are done in such a way that there's a question of one happened one after the other or simultaneous. So let's keep reading. We learned in a Mishna elsewhere, Tractate Tamura, if one had two animals standing before him, one was a burnt offering and the other a peace offering, right? He had already designated them. One to be a burnt offering, an olah, and the other to be a shlamim, a peace offering. And he said, with regard to another non-sacred animal of his, right, a third animal that he had not consecrated, and he says, this animal, the third non-consecrated animal, this animal is hereby the substitute of the burnt offering, the substitute of the peace offering. So he makes two statements, right? That he's going to substitute, this one's going to be a substitute for the burnt offering, a substitute for the peace offering. So what happened? First of all, it's kind of a weird statement to make. Well, why did he speak in two sentences like that? Was this at two separate times or was it one after the other? Normally, there would be a conjunction. If he was planning to substitute this one for both of those, he wants to take those back and only send one up to the temple, he might have said, this is a substitute for the burnt offering and the peace offering. But he said, this is a substitute for the burnt offering, a substitute for the peace offering. So what's the result? Then, that animal is the substitute of the burnt offering. The first statement he made. It became a substitute for the burnt offering. It is now going to be a burnt offering. And of course, the first burnt offering remains a burnt offering. That's the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yosei says, if that was his intent from the outset, i.e. his intent was that this animal be the substitute of both a burnt offering and a peace offering, since it is impossible to produce two designations simultaneously, because you can't speak two words at the same time, and one designation must, because of the way we speak language, one designation must precede the other. So his statement is effective, right? Meaning the animal is a substitute for both the burnt offering and a peace offering. I don't know what you do with it then, because right, they remain a burnt offering and a peace offering, and the substitute has to become one of them, but somehow now according to Rabbi Yosei, it is a substitute for both. But if it was only after he said, this animal is hereby a substitute for the burnt offering, and then he reconsidered and said, actually, but he didn't say the word actually, this animal is hereby the substitute of the peace offering. He's actually changing his mind. He wasn't intending for it to be a substitute for both. He said it's a substitute for the burnt offering, and then he changed his mind and said, no, actually, it's a substitute for the peace offering. Then that animal is a substitute for the burnt offering alone. His first designation takes hold, not because he wasn't planning to substitute for both, and we can figure that out from the way that he spoke. Now, a dilemma was raised, or at least from what his intention was. He can state what his intention was. A dilemma was raised before the sages. If one expressed the two intentions simultaneously and said, this is hereby the substitute of a burnt offering and a peace offering. Right? That's where in our speech the word and has significance. That word matters, right? I remember very much when I was in law school, thinking that, wow, I was an English major in college, but I never really focused on how language operates in the real world and how people bind themselves with statements, and how, when you say I promise, right, or I declare, or I thee wed, right? Those are performative statements, meaning that when you say those words, you've also committed an action, right? You have bound yourself in some way. And you need to be very precise in what you're saying when you're speaking binding words. So dilemma was raised before the sages. If one expressed the two intentions simultaneously, and he said, this is hereby the substitute of a burnt offering and a peace offering, what is the law? Sounds like that was Rabbi Yossei's first case, right? Where there was no and, but this would clarify that the guy meant to substitute for the two animals. Additionally, if one specified his intention to split the animal between a burnt offering and a peace offering, but mentioned the burnt offering first, then what is the law? Imagine there was no substitute issue. He was just saying, I hereby consecrate this animal to be a burnt offering and a sin offering. Now, the first thing that came out of his mouth was, I hereby consecrate this animal to be a burnt offering. So is it a burnt offering? But he always meant to conclude by saying a burnt offering and a sin offering. Now, how can it be both? Maybe, if you really have now obligated yourself in bringing both, you need to, sell that animal and use the proceeds to bring a burnt offering and a sin offering. I'm not sure what the result is. But if having that intent from the outset and using the word and then creates the dual designation, okay, that's one outcome. But a different outcome might be that since the first thing out of his mouth was, I hereby designate this animal as a burnt offering, it already happened before he added the words and a peace offering. This is why... I'm not going to go into that. Okay. Then what? So the Gemara says, what is the law? So Abaye said, in this case, Rabbi Meir certainly concedes that both types of sanctity apply to the animal. Right? So Abaye said that Rabbi Meir concedes that where he was planning to say, I consecrate it as a burnt offering and a sin offering, Abaye claims that even Rabbi Meir would admit it acquires the dual designation because that was always his intent, and he, verbalized it in a way that shows that he had that dual intent. Rava said, no, it is still a disagreement. Rabbi Meir would still hold, in this case, that since he mentioned the burnt offering first, only that sanctity would apply to the animal. Rava said to Abaye, according to your opinion, as you say that in this case, Rabbi Meir certainly concedes, one may raise an objection from the Mishna, which describes a case where one performs slaughter with intent to eat one olive bulk of the offering beyond its time and one olive bulk beyond its area, right? So at the time of one of the rites, at the time of slaughter, he had two intents in mind, both erroneous, one with respect to time and one with respect to area, both fulfilling the requirement of the minimum measure. That's why we say an olive bulk. So do we say that he had two mistaken intents and therefore pigul does not apply? Or do we say that even in his mind he articulated the intent with respect to time first and therefore pigul might apply? Right, so Rava said to Abaye, according to your opinion, as you say that in this case Rabbi Meir certainly concedes, we can raise an objection from this Mishnah that we're learning today, which describes a case where one performs slaughter with intent to eat one kezayit of the offering beyond its time and another kezayit beyond its area. And this is comparable to a case where one says to split, since both intentions are held during the singular act of slaughter. And nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis disagree. And Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that one attends only to the first statement, renders the animal pigul. Now, did this guy have two intents in mind simultaneously while he was slaughtering? Or, since he articulated in his mind one of those intents before the other, did that one take hold before the other to the exclusion of the other, which seems to be Rabbi Yehuda's point. The rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda are saying, well, no, it doesn't matter because at the time that he was slaughtering, he had already, formed both intents in his mind. And so, you can't say that it's only the mistake with respect to time, and therefore pigul should not apply. Abaye said to Rava, do you hold that slaughter is considered to have been performed only at its end, such that it takes effect in a single instant? Actually, slaughter is accomplished progressively, from beginning to end. Right? I guess the blade cuts across, right, the jugular and windpipe of the animal. It doesn't happen in an instant. It creates a cut, blood starts to gush out, and eventually the animal dies. So, it's not in one instant. And our Mishna is referring to a case where one says, I slaughter the first siman, the gullet, or the windpipe with intent to consume the offering beyond its designated time, and the second siman with intent to consume it outside its designated area. Right? So Abaye is saying that Rabbi Yehuda could have said there were two different intents at two different times. They weren't simultaneous. And if the intent with respect to time came first, at the time of the beginning of the slaughtering, then that took hold. And that's why pigul would apply. And the fact that he articulated another error afterward, it's as if he articulated that second error during conveying the blood or during sprinkling the blood. Because even within slaughter, there's a before and after, a beginning, middle, and end of that process. The Gemara asks, but what about the removal of a handful from a meal offering with intent to eat one olive bulk beyond its time and one outside of its area, which is comparable to a case where one says to split since both intentions are being held during the removal, right? So when we remove the flour, the fine flour for a meal offering, that doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end, right? He just grabs it and removes it. Right? So if he has two intents, one about time and one about place, they're simultaneous because he's saying that the gathering the flour, the comets, happens in one move. Even if you claim that slaughter happens, has a beginning, middle, and end, this would seem to have only one instant when it's actually happening. And the Gemara asks, all right, so that was the question. And so therefore he could have two intents at the same time. And nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis disagree with regard to it in Tractate Menachos, which would seem to indicate that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't care, even if it's simultaneous, he's not going to concede, and he could say that there could be one before the other. And the Gemara responds, since the Mishnah does not state such a dispute explicitly, one can say that their disagreement is not with regard to the removal of the handful, but with regard to the burning of the two permitting factors of the meal offering, the handful and the frankincense. When a meal offering is brought, frankincense is also burned. So one goes on the altar first, the flour, and then the frankincense. So there's a split in time, and maybe he had the intent with respect to time while the flour went on the altar, and error with respect to place when the frankincense went on the altar. And so you could identify which came first, and if there was the mistake with respect to time came first, Rabbi Yehuda would say that's why pigul took hold. The Gemara persists, but what about the handful from a meal offering of a sinner, which has no frankincense with it? And still Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis disagree. So the Gemara responds, in that case, they do not disagree. Rav Ashi says, even if you say that they disagree, in that case, one may say that they disagree specifically with regard to a case where the priest had different intentions during his steps toward the altar. It's like conveying the blood while holding the handful of flour. Consequently, even this rite is divisible into separate parts, and you could say that the intents could happen at different times. Rav Shimi bar Ashi would teach in accordance with the opinion of Abaye that in a case where one explicitly mentions both intentions at once, Rabbi Meir concedes that both sanctities apply to the animal. Rav Huna bar Nassan would teach in accordance with the opinion of Rava that even in such a case, Rabbi Meir considers only the first sanctity mentioned. Again, we're back to the case of the substitute, the Tamura. or when or just in general consecrating, and you have two offerings that you're thinking of consecrating this animal as, which one took hold? Did it happen simultaneously, or is it the one that was mentioned first is the only one that took hold, even though you were intending to assign a dual designation? Rabbi Meir would say that the first one you mentioned is the only one that takes hold, and it seems like perhaps you would say the same thing here in our case of having a mistaken intent, that the first intent that you had is the one that takes hold. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said, when Rabbi Meir said that if one says, this animal is here by the substitute of a burnt offering, the substitute of a peace offering, right, where it's unclear, did he change his mind in between, or did he always mean to substitute for both animals? So in that original case, that when Rabbi Meir says that if one says this animal is here by the substitute of a burnt offering, the substitute of a peace offering, then the animal is a substitute of a burnt offering, because that's what he said first. That's what Rabbi Meir looks to. But he said this according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that in general, the law is to attend only to the first statement. So Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda seem to be on the same page. As we learned in the Mishna, Rabbi Yehuda said that this is the principle. If the intent with regard to time preceded the intent with regard to area, the offering is pigul, and one is liable to receive kares for burning or partaking of it, if he violates that prohibition. Now we're on 30b. Abaye said to Rav Dimi, but doesn't Rabbi Bar Chana say that Rabbi Yochanan says, when you consider their opinions, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosei do not disagree with one another, i.e. neither holds that one attends only to the first statement. Rav Dimi objected, and is it so that they do not disagree? But don't they disagree explicitly in the Mishnah that was cited earlier? Abaye said to him, they disagree where they disagree, i.e. that specific case, but they do not disagree where they don't disagree. Don't say that because they disagree on one thing, they disagree on everything. Accordingly, one must understand the basis of their dispute in a different manner. And this is as Rav Yitzhak Bar Yosef says that Rabbi Yochanan says, all, in this case meaning Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosef, concede that in a case where one says, let this sanctity of a burnt offering take effect, and afterward let that sanctity of a peace offering take effect, everyone agrees that the sanctity of the peace offering does not take effect because you already made it a burnt offering. Likewise, if one said, this sanctity shall not take effect unless that sanctity applies, everyone agrees that the sanctity of a peace offering takes effect as well, because then you articulated clearly that you intended a dual designation, a dual consecration. You intended from the outset to consecrate this animal as two things, and so both sanctities will take hold. Whereas if you spoke words that were less clear, and you mentioned one sanctity first, that's where we have the disagreement. That does that sanctity take hold by itself, or since he later mentioned the second sanctity, do both take hold? They disagree with regard to a case where one says, the animal is hereby a substitute for a burnt offering, a substitute for a peace offering. Rabbi Meir holds, since if he wanted both sanctities to take effect, he should have said a substitute for a burnt offering and a peace offering, that ever important conjunction and. He should have said that, then we would have understood his meaning. But instead, he said a substitute for a burnt offering, comma, a substitute for a peace offering. Learn from his language that he originally intended it for it to be a burnt offering, and then he retracted his first intention. Right? Rabbi Meir is saying that when he said one statement, and then he uttered a contradictory statement right after it, it's because he changed his mind. Not because he intended the two things to take hold simultaneously. But Rabbi Yosei holds that if he had said a substitute for a burnt offering and a peace offering, I would say that he means that half the animal should be a substitute for a burnt offering and half a substitute for a peace offering. He therefore says a substitute for a burnt offering, a substitute for a peace offering. That is to say that all of it is a burnt offering and all of it is a peace offering. Different meaning. In any event, according to this explanation, Rabbi Meir does not necessarily hold that one attends only to the first statement. Rav Dimi said to Abaye, he, meaning Rabbi Bar Chana, says that they do not disagree, but I say that they disagree. And Rabbi Meir holds that one attends only to the first statement, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah. Now the Gemara returns to discuss our Mishnah. Ula said, and some say it was Rabbi Oshaya who said, perhaps our colleagues, the Babylonians, right, as opposed to the sages operating in Israel, which was at that time occupied by Rome, where there was less freedom to learn and teach Torah compared to the thriving Jewish community in Babylonia, where they were free to learn and teach Torah, which was part of the Persian Empire. Ula said, and some say it was Rav Oshaya who said, perhaps our colleagues, the Babylonians, know whether we learn the language of the improper intention in the Mishnah as, I hereby slaughter the animal with intent to consume an olive bulk beyond its designated time, an olive bulk outside its designated area, or we learn an olive bulk beyond its designated time and an olive bulk outside its designated area, right? So they're again bringing that same analysis that we use for consecrating animals as a substitute now for forming this erroneous intent at the time of slaughter, right? Did the guy say to himself, again, this is all very hypothetical, but the point is, he satisfied the prohibition, or he did what the prohibition describes as the error that disqualifies, right? So at the time that he's slaughtering, did he say to himself, I'm going to eat an olive bulk of this meat beyond its time? No. I'm going to eat that olive bulk outside of its area, right? So now he replaced the first error with the second error. Or was he holding both errors? I'm going to eat one olive bulk of this meat outside its time, and I'm going to eat another olive bulk of this meat outside its area. And he's had both simultaneously. So for sure, that second case, pigul doesn't apply. But perhaps in the first case, where he first formulates a mistaken intention with respect to time, and then then he adds another one. So does it replace the first one? Is it in addition to the second one, to the first one? Since there was no and, since this is all happening in his thoughts anyway, but then he articulates what his intent was by saying, I had an intent with respect to time, I had an intent with respect to place. Is that an and? Is that it actually? And then I changes his mind? Like how are we going to characterize that? So the Gemara elaborates. Perhaps we learn an olive bulk, comma, an olive bulk. And it is only in this case that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the rabbis, where he says the first mistake took hold, and it is pigul. But if one said an olive bulk and an olive bulk, then perhaps even Rabbi Yehuda would agree with the rabbis that these were simultaneous, and therefore pigul would not apply. They would agree that this is a combination of intentions, and the animal would therefore not be pigul. Or perhaps we learn an olive bulk and an olive bulk, where according to Rabbi Yehuda, each term constitutes a separate term despite the use of the conjunction and therefore he holds that one attends only to the first statement, and all the more so if he said an olive bulk, separated only by the comma. Right? Perhaps Rabbi Yehuda would say, even in the case of the and, that the first one only took hold, and then without the and, for sure, only the first one took hold. So the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from that dilemma which Levi raised before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. If one had intent to consume an olive bulk the next day outside the designated area, what is the law? Rabbi said to him, this is an excellent question. The answer is that even Rabbi Yehuda concedes that this constitutes a combination of intentions, and the animal is not pigul. Right, so the intention was both to eat it the next day outside the area. Now, it's definitely a combination. His intent is, I'm going to eat it beyond its time and in the wrong place. But it's not, I'm going to eat one outside its time and I'm going to eat one outside its place. Here he's saying, I'm going to eat one olive bulk on the wrong day and in the wrong place. So that's got to be a combination, right? And therefore it's not pigul. So Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rebbe, said before him, how is this an excellent question? Is it not our Mishnah? As we learned in the Mishnah, if one expressed intent to eat an olive bulk outside its place, and an olive bulk the next day, or an olive bulk the next day, and an olive bulk outside its place, or half an olive bulk outside its place, and half an olive bulk the next day, or half an olive bulk the next day, and half an olive bulk outside its place, the offering is disqualified, and there is no liability for kares, for burning or partaking of it. So Rabbi Yehuda disagrees only with regard to these cases, but in another case, it could easily be inferred that he concedes that it constitutes a combination of intentions. Rebbe said to him, Levi asked me a matter of wisdom, and you say our Mishnah? For you, whom I taught two phrasings of the Mishnah, both an olive bulk, and an olive bulk, and an olive bulk, the question is not difficult, since my omission of this other case allows you to infer its halacha. But for him, whom I taught only one of the phrasings, and who heard the rabbis reciting two, it is an excellent question. Since Levi thought, perhaps my phrasing is exact, and their additional phrasing constitutes a combination of intentions according to all opinions. Or perhaps their phrasing is exact, and my phrasing omitted this case. And if my phrasing omitted this case, perhaps their phrasing also omitted that other case, even though it is subject to disagreement. You could see how precise they're being with the language, what exactly is being said, who is saying it. Does he have all the information that I have? Are we talking about exactly the same question? You can see why guys who went to yeshiva and did this kind of analysis in high school or beyond high school in college, and then they go to law school, they're always the geniuses, right? Because this is how you learn to parse logic and meaning and force of law and understanding the context and what the founders and the people who wrote the Constitution, what they intended, what information they were working with, when the law is applied, what intent did the person who broke the law have, what knowledge did he have? In what context was this done? If it's about a contract dispute, under what context was the contract written? Is it being applied in New York, but the contract was written in Florida? I mean, there are so many variables that have to be taken into account so that you can parse out and figure out exactly where justice lies. And if you're not accustomed to doing this kind of analysis, it's very difficult. But if you've been doing this for years, you have a big advantage when you get into, legal discussions under, common law jurisprudence, or the law of other nations. So the Gemara asks, and which phrasing did Rebbe teach Levi? If we say that he taught him an olive bulk and an olive bulk, i.e. that Rabbi Yehuda still holds the terms to be distinct despite the conjunction and, well, then this is not an omission, since one can infer, kal v'chomer, that the same applies to an olive bulk, comma, an olive bulk. So rather, it must be that he taught him an olive bulk, comma, an olive bulk, so that it was unclear to Levi what the law would be if one used the conjunction and. So the Gemara asks, if so, why did Levi raise a dilemma with regard to the phrasing the next day outside? Let him raise a dilemma with regard to the phrasing an olive bulk and an olive bulk. So the Gemara responds, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara responds, Levi thought, I will raise one dilemma before him so as to learn two laws. As if I ask only with regard to an olive bulk and an olive bulk, it will work out well if he says to me that Rabbi Yehuda concedes that they constitute one general term, as this would apply all the more so if one said an olive bulk the next day outside the area, which is even more unified. But if he says to me that each term constitutes a separate term according to Rabbi Yehuda, then I will still need to raise the dilemma with regard to the case of an olive bulk the next day outside. So I will therefore inquire with regard to the latter case. It covers more situations, right? Like that, it's a little bit like that old puzzle. If you're in a room, there are two doors and two guards in front of the doors. One door is freedom. The other door is death. There's a man-eating tiger behind that door. One of the guards always tells the truth. One of the guards always lies. You don't know which guard is which. You don't know which door is which. And you only have one question. How can you ask a question that will guarantee that you escape alive from that room? You can think about it a little. I'll give the answer later. The Gemara challenges, if so, now to it work. But the point being that Levi was formulating his question for Rebbe, trying to, anticipate what can I get the most information from my teacher with the fewest questions. Right? So the Gemara challenges, if so, now too, it works out well if he says to him that Rabbi Yehuda maintains that the wording, an olive bulk the next day outside, is constituted of separate terms, right? Because there's beyond its time and beyond its place, even though it's stated in one statement. I'm going to eat it at the wrong time and in the wrong place. An olive bulk and an olive bulk, which is less unified. But if he says to him that it is one general term according to Rabbi Yehuda, then he will still need to raise the dilemma with regard to the case of an olive bulk and an olive bulk. So the Gemara responds, if Rebbe answered in this manner, i.e., that Rabbi Yehuda concedes that an olive bulk the next day and outside the area is considered one term, he would unwittingly provide the answer to the other question as well, as if Rabbi Yehuda had also conceded with regard to an olive bulk and an olive bulk, Rebbe would become angry with Levi for asking the wrong question and say, now that Rabbi Yehuda concedes that even an olive bulk and an olive bulk is one general term, not two distinct statements, is it necessary to inquire with regard to an olive bulk the next day outside, which is even more closely unified? Now we're at the top of 31a, and the Gemara presents another version of this discussion. Rebbe might say that if Rabbi Yehuda maintains that even when one says an olive bulk the next day outside, each term is considered separate, then is it necessary to inquire with regard to an olive bulk, an olive bulk, which would obviously be separate. Okay, that's what we'll knock off. I'll take some comments and questions now, but I'll remind you that I'm going on a family trip. So no class until Friday, a week from today. And we'll post that on the Facebook page, but no class until Friday, a week from today. And then remind me to answer the riddle. Okay, so Joseph, I wonder if priests had some sort of record-keeping process for all the sacrifices so no confusion takes place. Modern accounting originated in medieval times for tithing matters, and medieval times is quite a bit later than what the priests had. It's a great question, Joseph. I mean, it's almost like, it's expected that when you're playing golf, you will remember how many shots you took on each hole. Although, bad players who take a lot of shots, like, it's one into the woods, one in the woods, one out of the woods. No, it's two out of the woods, right? They could give themselves a better score because people tend to, when they make mistakes due to forgetfulness, somehow it always goes in their favor, right? And so some people, knowing that, carry like a little counter, like a little bead thing, like where they can just slide beads from one place to another so to help them keep count. So, we spent so much time talking about all these errors that are made. Was it just a given that the priests would make sure to have the correct intent unless some weird thing happened? Or did they need little reminders along the way since they were working with a lot of offerings, especially Erev Pesach, right? When just, 1 million people ascend to Jerusalem and are bringing all those Pesachim, those Pesach offerings. We all know what kind of offering is being brought, but you could lose track if you have several sheep that you're slaughtering and conveying the blood to the altar. Whose sheep is whose. So probably the priests would just make sure to do their job and not think about any particular person. But still, were there some systems in place to help them remember what they needed to remember? I don't know, but it's a good question. Sharon, this may seem very simplistic, but why can't the sacrifice be designated prior to the initiation of the sacrifice and be irrevocable? In other words, why not have a rabbinic ordinance that once you establish an intent at the beginning of the process, that's the intent. And it doesn't matter what the priest is thinking the rest of the way, as long as he does the job properly. What difference does it make if he had the wrong intent at the time of sprinkling? I'm not sure. I don't know. It would have solved problems, but they didn't make such an ordinance. And you know what? They couldn't, because rabbinic ordinances don't apply in the Holy Temple. So you could say, well, maybe the priest could have made a house rule that whatever your intent was at the outset, that's it. There's no further intent. But maybe that would still not square with what the law says, since there is already some mention of intent when it comes to pigul that is mentioned in the Torah. And so maybe they can't make such a house rule. And the bottom line is the mind could wander, and then if he realizes that it wandered to the wrong place, they would disqualify the offering. And I don't know. It's a great question. I don't know any other answer. Lucy, do any of these sacrifice cases become a law in the Shulchan Aruch? I'm thinking probably not, as even in the time of the Mishna, the sages of the Mishna, there was no temple anymore. By the time the Mishnah was redacted in the year 200, yes, but definitely sages who have sayings in the Mishnah did live during the Second Temple period. So probably the sages, most of the sages, right, certainly the Amoraim, never experienced these sacrifices. Some of the sages of the Mishnah did. So it seems to me, says Lucy, that this tractate describes temple sacrifices as very difficult to do correctly, or even to evaluate, as so much relies on intentions, and maybe that is why I find this tractate so difficult to follow and to connect with, because it seems mostly a mental exercise, does not seem to connect much with the lives of people. I mean, I understand where you're coming from. I am like, today I feel like I'm in, and I could follow what I was teaching. And I confess there are times when I get lost. I mean, it's just so hard. Several of the classes that we've had this past week and last week there was just times where I wasn't sure what I was saying. And I'm sure that as your teacher, if I don't know what I'm saying, who could follow me? I'm confused. And I failed you in that, and I apologize. But today I stayed with it. And so I don't think it's sort of like counting angels dancing on the head of a pin, right? Or splitting hairs, is usually said in a kind of mocking way. I think that, but I think you're also right that for most of the history of the temple and the Mishkan, the tabernacle before it, they hadn't had this level of depth and analysis among the elders and the prophets and the priests, of course, who were actually bringing the sacrifices. They probably developed a routine. I mean, remember, they were doing this for 1,200 years. So for sure, they had, routines of how to do things. And I'm sure that a lot of these questions never came up in the real world. And the sages later, who, parsed at a level that it was incredible because they developed those kind of analytical tools and skills and desire, went to a depth that maybe, hadn't been gone to before. And it's a fascinating thing, right? That they're dealing with questions that probably never came up in the real world at a time when they couldn't come up because the temple was already destroyed. Now, we will have the Gemara and the answers to all these questions, when Mashiach comes and the third temple goes up. Now, some people think that animal sacrifices won't be brought at that time. I know Sharon subscribes to that. She's mentioned it. And other people think we will, because, there's all these laws that we just can't fulfill in the absence of a temple. But when the temple comes back, we will. I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. None of us do. And only Mashiach knows. But if animals are sacrificed at that time, we will have the benefit of this. And so your question is, these laws of sacrifices, are they included in the Shulchan Aruch? I mean, that question is easily answered. I just don't know off the top of my head. The Shulchan Aruch is the sort of codified book of how we live our lives, right? The practical laws that we live by. Now, I think there are in Shulchan Aruch, like the laws of, the gluttonous son, right? Which, as we learned earlier, like there never was a son who was killed, who was executed according to the law that's specified in the Torah, for one that, just eats and drinks and, is living the life of a sinner and is likely to become a murderer later, but hasn't become one yet. And yet the Torah says his parents bring him to the gates of the town, to the judges, and say, this son is a sinner and a glutton. No good will come of him, and better he should be executed now. And the sages legislated requirements for what it would take to execute such a person that are so beyond, what could ever happen in the real world, that law was never, ever carried out or enforced. But I still think that law is in Shulchan Aruch. So do the laws of the sacrifices and all these nuances about intention, do they end up in Shulchan Aruch? They certainly end up in Rambam, right? In Maimonides. He definitely analyzes this and looks at them among the rest of the 613 commandments. But I think really the importance of this, and I think maybe God always intended it this way, is for us to break our teeth, right? In other words, to dig in, break our teeth in not an unkind way, but to dig in and keep chomping at it and keep working at it. This is not easy stuff, right? People who really understood these laws, or people who study them now, in the great yeshivas, they work on this. They would never spend, one day on one page of Zevachim to try to develop a real understanding of it. They would probably spend a month on one page to really get to the bottom of it and understand it. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again next week, a week from today. Please keep learning. Please keep studying. We'll be a little bit behind, but we'll make it up. And please, may we only hear good. Please God, may we only hear good news going into Shabbos, during Shabbos, coming out of Shabbos. May the peace of Israel and Jerusalem hold a secure and lasting peace. Again, thank you, God, that all the living hostages are home. And I'll miss you guys, and I look forward to learning with you again next Friday. All the best. Good Shabbos.